Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the committee in 2019. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and any electronic devices being used to access committee papers should please be turned to silent. We have received apologies from Kenneth Gibson MSP, and I welcome Emma Harper MSP again to the committee, who is attending as a substitute member. As members will be aware, we had been due to take evidence this morning from the UK Government Minister James Duddridge MP with regard to Brexit. Unfortunately, Mr Duddridge withdrew from appearing at the committee yesterday morning, and I want to place on record that I regard this as deeply discourteous to both the committee and to the Scottish Parliament, particularly at this critical juncture in the Brexit process, that we have not been able to hear from a Brexit minister. Indeed, we haven't been able to hear from a Brexit UK minister throughout this particular year. So I consider it imperative that the committee hears from a UK government Brexit minister before the deadline of the 31st of October. Our first item on the agenda today is consideration of the UEFA European Championship Scotland Bill at Stage 1, and I welcome to the committee the Scottish Government's Bill team, Lucy Carmichael, the Bill team leader, Derek Bearhope, Head of Event Strategy and Delivery, and Kirsten Simonet-Lefebvre, the Principal Legal Officer. And I'd like to invite Lucy Carmichael to make a brief opening statement of 1 to 2 minutes.
If I may, Convener, I'll make that statement.
Okay,
thank you very much, and good morning. Scottish Government is proud that Glasgow has been selected as one of the 12 cities co-hosting the UEFA European Football Championships next summer, one of the largest sporting events in the world. Glasgow and Scotland have a strong record of successfully delivering major global sporting events, which bring significant benefits for our economy and for our international reputation. Since Glasgow's bid to be part of Euro 2020 was successful, a local organising committee has been created to aid delivery of the championship as a whole, and includes the Scottish Football Association, the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council, Hampden Park Limited, Visit Scotland and Police Scotland. These organisers have been making good progress, and UEFA have confirmed that they are satisfied that planning is well on track. The Scottish Government did not initially expect that additional legislation would be required to deliver the event. However, as UEFA's requirements became clearer, it became evident that primary legislation would be necessary to provide the level of protection that UEFA sought, and to ensure that our arrangements were consistent with those for the other venues around Europe. Formal confirmation that additional legislation would be required was received from UEFA in April 2019, and the Scottish Government has been working swiftly to develop the UEFA European Championship Bill since then. UEFA indicated that many of the provisions in the Glasgow Commonwealth Games Act of 2008 would be appropriate, and in preparing this new bill, we have sought to learn from the 2008 Act, the last piece of legislation for a major event in Scotland. The bill was introduced on 24 September. It aims to help ensure successful delivery of the event through putting in place protections for commercial rights in relation to ticket touting, street trading and advertising. The bill also contains measures in relation to enforcement. Subject to parliamentary approval, the Scottish Government is proposing that this bill completes its parliamentary process more quickly than usual, so that the secondary legislation can be laid early in 2020 in order to give affected businesses as much time as possible to prepare. As the requirement for a bill was only recently confirmed, there has not been time for a formal public consultation on the bill, and so the Scottish Government has undertaken targeted engagement with businesses and others with an interest so that they understand what is being proposed and can provide their views. The Scottish Government, in liaison with Glasgow City Council, intends to continue to publicise the restrictions on advertising, street trading and ticket touting in the run-up to the event, to raise awareness among businesses and the public. The bill provides for 3 event zones in Glasgow, and earlier this week, the Minister for Europe, Migration and International Development shared draft maps of the proposed Hampden Park and George Square zones with this committee, along with proposed dates of operation of these zones. The Scottish Government expects to share the map and dates of the 3rd proposed zone in Glasgow's Merchant City soon. Preparation of illustrative regulations is also underway so that the Scottish Government can indicate to Parliament how it expects to use the powers included in the bill. In light of the expedited timescale, the Scottish Government is grateful to the committee for undertaking consideration of the bill swiftly. We are happy to answer any questions that the committee has about the bill.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I think everyone in the committee understands the importance of these championships and the importance to Glasgow and to Scotland and the economic benefits that it will bring, not just during the championship but future major events in Scotland, and it's important that we get it right. I guess I'm a little perplexed as to why it's taken this length of time to bring the legislation forward. I mean, on page 5 of the policy memorandum that the Scottish Government prepares, it makes it very clear in paragraph 27 that Scots law restricts ticket touting through section 55 of the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982, but that doesn't specifically criminalise the touting of tickets. So we were very clear that clearly there is a bit of a gap in Scots law there with regards to ticket touting, which is why this bill has been brought forward. Now, that's why the Commonwealth Games Bill would have been brought forward as well. But I note that the Commonwealth Games Bill passed the year after we won the Commonwealth Games, within a year, and that's in 2008, well ahead of the Games. We're looking here to understand that we knew Glasgow would be hosting the Games back in 2014, and it's taken us till now to bring forward this legislation to cover a failing in Scots law that we presumably have always known existed. So I just wondered why it's taken that length of time.
Yeah, happy to answer that. So there have been detailed discussions with UEFA and with other partners organising the event over a period of time since we found out that the bid was successful. That has covered quite a range of areas. I think you are correct in saying that the issue around about ticket touting, the limitation around about those powers, we've been aware of that for a while and obviously had taken action for the Commonwealth Games. I'm not sure whether a single issue bill might have been considered to have been the best use of parliamentary time. So we were kind of working with UEFA to see and other partners to see what we could do with our existing powers on ticket touting with the measures that you've mentioned already, but then also with the other commercial rights protection that UEFA was looking to put in place around about street trading and advertising, and really going in quite a lot of detail through what those existing provisions would permit us to do at present. Because really we were viewing bringing forward primary legislation as a matter of kind of last resort because of making best use of parliamentary time. It didn't become clear, as Derek said, until the 1st of April that a bill would definitely be required, and we have been working as swiftly as possible since then to undertake engagement with people that we think would be affected and to prepare the bill. And as Derek said, we are very grateful to we're sorry that it's come forward so late, and we're very grateful to the committee for working with us around about the kind of swifter than usual timescale.
Right, okay, thank you for that. Can you tell me how many of the 12 countries that are hosting these matches are required to pass primary legislation?
Yeah, so UEFA provided an update to me yesterday. So there's Scotland, Russia, Italy, Azerbaijan and Ireland have engaged with primary legislation. And then there will be other countries that are bringing forward secondary legislation, including England. And then the remaining 6 hosts are reaching the required levels of protection via other means. So there's a range of different activity across the 12 host cities.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. I have a supplementary from Donald Cameron.
It's just on that point about primary legislation. I mean, can you ever foresee a major sporting event not requiring primary legislation?
So I think there have been previous events. So when it depends, I guess, what you class as a major event. So the cup final, the UEFA Cup final in 2007, there were no additional protections that were required for that. I don't believe that we had any legislation for the European Championships that took place in Glasgow last year.
There are only a handful of right holders who tend to insist on rights protection, such as UEFA have asked for. You know, as Lucy said, we had the European Championships in Glasgow last year, which did not require legislation. We've just just come off the back of Solheim Cup, where Ladies European Tour, LPGA, have not required rights protection for their events. So it tends to be organisations like IOC, FIFA, Commonwealth Games Federation, in this case UEFA, doesn't really go much beyond that in my experience.
So would it be right to say you're slightly at the mercy of the organisations who are running these events, it seems, and it seems it's slightly unpredictable way forward. You just don't really know whether you'll need primary or secondary legislation.
I wouldn't use the term at the mercy. I mean, we are actively bidding for these events, and we do so in the knowledge of what might be expected of us. I think in this instance it wasn't totally clear whether primary legislation was necessarily the solution or whether we could have either secondary legislation or another adaptive solution. But ultimately, as the convener said at the outset, major events are beneficial, we believe, therefore we're competitive in seeking to host them in Scotland.
No, I don't mean to dispute that at all, and clearly that's the case. Thank you.
Is this your supplementary on this topic? Yes,
Just for clarification, when Hampden hosted the Champions League final a few years ago, also there wasn't primary legislation for that. Was there any secondary legislation required for that particular event?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I can double check that and come back to you if that's not the case, but certainly I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. The legislation that's been introduced is similar to the Commonwealth Games legislation in terms of the ticket touting and the offences and the fan zones. Have you done an evaluation of the 2014 Commonwealth Games and how the legislation operated in those circumstances? And has that influenced this piece of legislation in any way?
So there wasn't a formal evaluation of how the legislation operated in practice. Since the requirement for this bill has been confirmed, we've been working with partners, in particular Glasgow City Council and their kind of enforcement officers who were in place at the time, to see if there was any learning that we could take forward from the event that would require changes to be made to the bill. And we've been doing the same thing when we've been engaging with other stakeholders where they had experience of the provisions that were in place for the Commonwealth Games. We've been asking them about learning and kind of experience from that.
And is that process of engaging with the traders and the council who experienced the last piece of legislation, is that engagement only happening at the pace that we're having to deal with the bill? Is it all quite short timescales? It
is shorter timescales than would be usual. We are trying to do as much consultation and engagement as we possibly can, but the timescales for that are limited.
So at this point, is there any issues that have been identified to you as being problematic with the legislation the last time, or was everybody seemed to be quite content with how it operated the last time?
The people that we've spoken to so far have broadly been content with how the legislation operated last time, yes.
Okay. And another question about the ticket touting. As the convener said, there appears to be a gap in Scottish legislation around ticket touting. It's obviously been an issue of concern, not just in sporting issues, but in music and other venues as well. I've asked in the Chamber before why the legislation couldn't be extended, the Commonwealth Games legislation, why we couldn't retain some of the legislation that was introduced around ticket touting and make it a permanent feature in Scotland. Why has that not happened, and what are the challenges with that?
So this bill will create a criminal offence specifically for ticket touting for this event only. There are some differences in terms of how tickets might be sold for events. For this particular event, UEFA are the only authorised seller of tickets, and they also control the secondary ticketing market. So they would be the only people selling the tickets, so it doesn't, I guess, stray into affecting other businesses that might be involved in ticketing. The bill, therefore, doesn't affect the rights or obligations of people buying or selling tickets or the existing law relating to secondary ticketing, so it doesn't fall under consumer protection, which is generally reserved to Westminster. Kirsten, I don't know if there's anything around the legal position that you'd want to add to that.
No, I think that's covered all the points about consumer protection being reserved and how the Consumer Rights Act 2015 has specific provisions which apply to the whole of the United Kingdom in relation to secondary ticketing.
So why has this piece of legislation not come under consumer protection? Because it's linked to a major event, or?
So it creates a criminal offence which is linked to rights protection, and UEFA are the only authorised seller of the particular tickets.
Yes, the ban is to stop the offence of touting. It's not making any provision in relation to the contractual relationship between the purchaser and the seller of the tickets. It's to protect the branding and the integrity of the championship, because the tickets are only sold by UEFA and no other ticketing agents, and they also resell tickets that people are not able to use because the tickets are not transferable. They're only for the person who purchased them.
Right. Mike Rumbles might come in, because he did raise a question around ticket touting and UEFA's position on this. I don't know. I'll ask the question if...
Mike's next.
Well,
Okay.
I'll hand over to... I understand there's an issue that he would like to pursue, so I'll hand over.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Mike Rumples.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Claire. On ticket touting, I'm very pleased to see ticket touting in here, but what has puzzled me, genuinely puzzled me, is I understand that this is reserved for UEFA to sell tickets, of course, and you want to protect the branding of that. But why, in section 2, subsection 4 of the bill, it specifically says that ticket touting offence doesn't apply to ticket touting done by UEFA. Sorry, so ticket touting is banned for everybody else, but UEFA can get itself involved in ticket touting. It's very odd.
So I don't think that's the intent of that provision. I think it's to be clear that UEFA is not capable of committing a ticket touting offence because it is the rights holder. And I think we've got something similar later on in the bill for the advertising offence and for the trading offence as well.
So hang on, so nobody else can ticket tout, but if UEFA want to sell to people the tickets above the price of the tickets, then you're allowing them to ticket out.
So I guess our view is that UEFA sets the price that the tickets are sold at.
But they set the original price, and so a ticket, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this genuinely, but ticket touting is ticket touting. If there's a published price of a ticket, and this bill is banning ticket touting, how can the bill then say, but it doesn't apply to UEFA?
So UEFA will operate a secondary resale site, and I'm not aware that there would be any difference.
But they can increase the prices.
They could, and that wouldn't be considered tout. I'm not aware that they would have any intention to do so, but they are the rights holder and can set the price of a ticket.
Well, you're allowing to do that then in this bill by doing that. But if that wasn't there, you would just ban ticket touting.
But so I may be misunderstanding, but I think that UEFA is able to set the price for tickets.
Okay. Do I go on to enforcement?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Please. Moving on from ticket touting.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. Because I have a very quick supplementary on that. You said that UEFA are the rights holder. But my understanding of reading through the bill is that if a member of the public, is going to a match, has bought tickets, and his companion doesn't turn up, he is able to sell the ticket as long as he doesn't make a profit. He wouldn't be committing an offence if he sold the ticket without making a profit. Is that correct? So it's certainly correct that face value exchanges are not captured by the criminal offence. Those would not be in line with UEFA's terms and conditions of the ticket sale, but that's a separate matter. So it could be that if someone did that they would be refused entry to the stadium if the person who had bought the ticket wasn't present, but we certainly didn't want to criminalise someone who might not be able to attend. Right, okay. Thanks very much. Mike?
Enforcement?
Yes.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd like to focus on enforcement in the bill, starting with section 16, enforcement officer. When I read the bill, I was quite alarmed, actually, reading through this about the powers that seem to be given to individual people. That's before I read the submission that I received last night from the Scottish Police Federation. So I'd like to start looking at section 16B, 2B, I've got no problem with Glasgow City Council designating weights and measures officers as enforcement officers. That seems perfectly logical to me. But then it says meets such other criteria as may be specified by the Scottish ministers and regulations. When I read this, I thought, well, hang on a minute, this gives carte blanche to ministers to put whatever or no qualifications on who people are appointed. And as you know, our job is to make sure that we've got decent legislation going through here and we can amend the bill. What we can't do is amend regulations when they come forward. So, if I can ask you to address the point that the Scottish Police Federation have made to us, which is the Scottish Police Federation is strongly of the view that in order to safeguard the rights of the public, that ministers ought to be obliged, or obligated, they say here, to set specific criteria for the appointment of enforcement officers, including qualifying and limiting provisions. And I would say it needs to be on the face of the bill. That's what needs to be there. Any comment on that?
Okay. So, firstly, I'd like to place on record that we welcome feedback on the provisions from the Scottish Police Federation. So, we're grateful for that and happy to consider their submission in more detail. The enforcement provisions in this bill very closely replicate what was put in place for the Commonwealth Games, and I understand that there was a lot of discussion around about that as the Commonwealth Games Act was passing through Parliament. In terms of what will be included, or what we expect would be included in the regulations, we've been preparing illustrative regulations, and we would be happy to share those with Parliament as soon as we can.
Well, that would be helpful. At least if the committee knew what the government was going to put in the regulations, then I'd be happy with that.
And then that could inform further discussion on this issue. Yeah.
But before the bill goes through, that's what I...
Yes, yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Secondly, on paragraph 17(4, an enforcement officer may be assisted by any other person as may be reasonably required for the purposes of taking action under this section. And I put down on the bill, can anybody do this? So, in fact, when the Police Federation also say this creates the possibility of enforcement officers appointed potentially by a simple and act as an ad hoc designation, in other words, you, whose activities in seeking assistance and safeguarding private, well, let's just say, I'll cut to the chase. We have grave reservations about both principle and practice of this issue. If it is envisaged that 17(4) could see persons other than police officers being relied upon to assist, this creates a potential for a free-for-all with random citizens, subjected to potentially zero validation, able to exercise powers of entry and search, seizure and destruction. I mean, this is...
So, okay, I'll try and clarify. So that's absolutely not what the intention of this is.
Oh, good.
The Scottish, yes, the Scottish Government, we agree that enforcement officers should have appropriate skills and experience to carry out the role. And in the first instance, we would expect those officers to be drawn from Glasgow City Council. Our financial memo sets out a little bit more detail about the experience of the officers in Glasgow City Council. So the trading standards section, most of those officers worked on the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games when there was similar legislation in place, and the council does intend to provide training on the bill. We're not expecting that enforcement officers would be recruited from private companies, and I think, my recollection is that the example that had been discussed previously around about where an enforcement officer may require assistance was, for example, a locksmith if it was around about gaining access to a building.
Okay.
So it's not intended to be a broad, anyone can get involved.
That's great, but the intention is not there. I'm really pleased with that, but that's not what it says in the bill. So if we can think about, the government can think about amendments there to make that clear, then I'm sure we would be happy, certainly I would be happy to see that. And finally, if I may, in section 19(2, and also identified, and so does the Police Federation, 19(2, an enforcement officer may take to a place entered by virtue of this section any other person or equipment, etc. And the Police Federation, as I say when I was reading this last night, also felt, to quote them, they say, the Scottish Police Federation also finds the provision of section 19(2 to be extraordinary. What they're saying basically is, this is giving powers to individuals that the police don't have. Because if they enter a premises without warrant, they've got to have specific circumstances. This is a very wide-ranging power that you're giving to individuals. We don't know who those individuals are.
So I think my answer would probably be the same as to the previous question, but we can certainly look at that.
That'd be great. If the government can look at that and bring forward amendments so that we're happy. And if I may say so, I think this is the problem about not having time to properly consult with across the board. But we can leave it there.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Just really sticking for the moment on the general issue of enforcement. I mean, obviously, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to reflect on the Scottish Police Federation's letter to the committee members of yesterday, because obviously they raise a number of points. I mean, I will be putting to them when we, I think, have them before us later this morning, you know, what position they took with regard to the 2014 arrangements for the Commonwealth Games, because it seems to me that by and large, and perhaps you could confirm this, my understanding is that actually the enforcement arrangements are effectively the same, except for the addition of the power that Mike Rumbles was talking about in terms of the power of entry, because that wasn't there in 2014. But the other powers, the other offences, in terms of ticket touting, street trading, advertising, were offences created at the time of the 2014 Commonwealth Games. Yeah, is that correct?
Yeah, so certainly, I thought the powers in relation to enforcement were almost identical to 2014, but I can certainly double check that.
Check that and come back to it better.
Okay, because it seems to me that it's the creation of it's the obstructing that is the new offence. So that is the difference from 2014. So I just wonder if that is the key substantive difference in this area, what view the SPF took in 2014.
So I will double check that, because I thought there was an offence of obstruction. So
I think that's a very important point to check, because indeed, in terms of the SPF's letter at page 2, the paragraph at the top of the page, they talk about their concerns, and they say this is particularly evident with proposed powers on the use of force entry and search and seizure and destruction. It's use of the word particularly because if it's the case that there's other differences, I think we would need clarity on that. A general question, maybe just, you know, coming from left field here, why have an arrangement where you use trading standards officers and not the police? Why have that arrangement?
So I think trading standards officers already have a role around about policing, well, not policing, but enforcing restrictions around about counterfeit goods and some other kind of powers just now. And it then makes sense, I guess, to extend it into the trading and advertising offences. It's kind of akin to the role that they're doing already. I think also from a practical perspective, it reduces additional resourcing requirements on Police Scotland during the period of the championship. So we did look at whether it would make sense to give the powers only to Police Scotland. That would be different to what had happened for the Commonwealth Games. I think that would have created an additional burden for Police Scotland, and we thought that it would be possible for trading standards officers to carry out that role in a way that would be suitable.
Okay, well, in that regard, in terms of one of the reasons, therefore, it appears that this approach has been taken rather than just having the police do this without reference to trading standards officers, is concern about the potential impact on the police. In that regard, the information that we have thus far is that in terms of Glasgow City Council's manpower, they have 22 members of staff with this trading standards team, most of whom were designated enforcement officers of the 2012 Olympics and 2014 Commonwealth Games. However, they feel that they may require additional manpower, which they may seek from other local authorities. What total number are we talking about here? So 22 plus what?
So we're planning for a range of scenarios at the moment. Certainly the latest position from Glasgow City Council is that they will look to operate within the existing trading standards team. What will have an impact on that is the draw for the championship in particular. So we're not yet sure what matches will be played at Hampden. That will become slightly clearer later on this year, but won't become fully clear until after the Nations League takes place next year. So we're planning for a range of different options, and that's why there's a bit of a range of kind of costs that are included in the financial memo.
Sure, and if Scotland did qualify, which let's all hope that they do, so if that happened, what that would be the biggest draw? So what would be the kind of top end of the scale? It's just really to get an idea, because if the argument is that we've got to go down this route to inter alia, not to overburden the police at a busy time, what is the total kind of manpower we're talking about at the top end of the scale?
So I would want to double check with Glasgow City Council what their upper estimate would be in that circumstance. But certainly it would be the upper end of what's set out in the financial memorandum on potential costs.
Right. Okay, I mean, obviously we will ask the SPF to give us further clarity on their position. I don't know, are they suggesting that they do this and not the trading standards people?
I wouldn't want to speak for the Scottish Police Federation.
No, but in terms of the ongoing discussions in this committee that has been set up, I mean, has this been an issue that has been discussed, or has this suddenly just come from nowhere that there's this concern?
So Police Scotland are a member of the local organising committee, and Police Scotland have not indicated that they have any concerns about where things are set out in the bill. They're content with what we've got in it.
Okay, thank you. I have other questions in a slightly different area. Do you want me to hold fire?
Ross, you have questions about enforcement?
Yeah, they follow on quite directly.
Right.
Thanks, Convener.
We'll try to bring you in later, Annabelle.
So just to follow on directly from Annabelle Ewing's point around the enforcement powers of searching, I understand your argument in that extending this power to the enforcement officers is about reducing the burden on the police, but my understanding is that these searches can only take place in the presence of a police officer. How in that case is a significant reduction in the burden on the police?
So I think that there are a range of enforcement activities that enforcement officers will be undertaking. So some of that will be kind of patrolling around the event zones and speaking to people. So that I think a first step would be if someone's breaching one of the restrictions to kind of explain what the offence is to them and ask them to kind of move on if they're not supposed to be in the zone. So there's that kind of role around about it. There's then obviously the other powers that are set out around about being able to search and confiscate property. So I'll just need to find...
I mean, if it's just to be clear, if a search of property is to take place, it can only take place in the presence of a police officer. Why give that power to enforcement officers at all? Why does that power not just stay with the police officer who needs to be present anyway? Because there's provision here for searching without a warrant in certain circumstances, but obviously a police officer would need to be present
for that.
So why does that power not just stay with police officers who do, in limited circumstances, have the power to search without a warrant?
I think I would just say our starting point was the provisions in the 2008 Commonwealth Games equivalent legislation. That's what's replicated here. Our understanding is that the police were comfortable after dialogue with what eventually ended up on the face of the Act in 2008.
I understand that. I obviously wasn't here in 2008 though, and I'm scrutinising this piece of legislation, and I need to know why. I feel the committee needs to know why it's felt appropriate in these circumstances to give the search power to enforcement officers when they can only search in the presence of a police officer, and police officers have the ability to search. Why not just keep that power with the police? Because there's an accountability issue here. The accountability for police officers is very clear. It's the subject of a substantial amount of scrutiny in here, and there may be issues with it, but people understand the line of accountability if, for example, they wish to make a complaint about a police officer. To give this power somewhere else, where a police officer has to be present anyway, it confuses me why that's necessary. If you want to write to the committee with that would be fine. But just, I think I've got one more question, if that's okay, Convener.
We're supposed to be finished up by 12, by 10 for the next panel of witnesses.
I'll try and be
so
very, very brief with this thing.
As possible.
Just, and following on, sticking with these enforcement powers in particular, are these requirements set out by UEFA, or is this the Scottish Government's understanding of the best ways to meet requirements set out? I mean, would UEFA object if enforcement officers didn't have the power to search and destroy?
So certainly our starting point for the enforcement provisions was looking at what was in the Commonwealth Games Act and making it as closely aligned to that, because we understood that that had worked reasonably well in practice, and having spoken to stakeholders about it, we didn't get any feedback saying that it hadn't worked in practice. I haven't discussed whether those particular powers that you mention are or are not acceptable with UEFA.
But UEFA didn't ask for them, just to be clear, that these are not requirements. UEFA came to you and said, as a requirement of hosting this tournament, we require that enforcement officers are given the ability to X, Y and Z.
The discussions we've had have not been at that level of detail, is my understanding. And certainly we want to take time and look carefully at the Scottish Police Federation's response, and we would be very happy, we would like to meet them to discuss the points that they've raised in more detail, because there are a number of kind of quite detailed points that are picked out, and that's why I'm sort of flicking back and forth to find the appropriate bit in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Emma, did you want to come in on this point?
Yes. A really brief point. I mean, to pick up on Ross Greer's point, it's if we're defining the presence of a police officer, what does that mean? Is it in the same room? Is it in the same place? Is it 20 feet away? Does it mean that two people can inspect somebody's bag while a police officer is observing? So
it's used, the section I think that was being referred to is 20, which is around the use of reasonable force. So it says that you have to be accompanied, so I would assume those two people have to be together.
Okay. Stuart McMillan.
Yes, thank you. Just on this issue of the enforcement officers, were these concerns raised when the Commonwealth Games bill was going through the parliamentary process? And secondly, when these enforcement officers were in place throughout the Commonwealth Games, how were they deployed, and were there any issues raised about their conduct through the process when the Games were in operation?
So I'll take your second point first. We are certainly not aware of any concerns about specific incidents that were raised during the operation of the enforcement provisions during the Commonwealth Games. And that's certainly one of the things that we would like to discuss with the Scottish Police Federation, is whether there are any specific examples that they're aware of that perhaps we in the bill team are unaware of around about things that happened during the Commonwealth Games. So we absolutely want to try and find out, but we're not aware of anything just now.
See, these enforcement officers, how were they selected? Were they mainly like Glasgow City employees, or were they maybe employees from other local authorities who were brought in for
So there would
purposes?
have been a broader range of local authorities involved in the Commonwealth Games, because it spanned a number of different local authority areas.
Yeah, thank you.
Very much. Donald Cameron.
The policy memorandum states that you're content that this bill is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. One of the issues that the Scottish Police Federation touches upon in their submission, and it's been mentioned by Mike Rumbles already, is section 19.2. And they have question marks over that, whether that's compliant with Article 6. Could I just ask you to look at that again to make sure that you are content that it is convention compliant? Because my view is a lot of the issues around enforcement officers in general, and this in specific, do raise questions under the convention. You may want to reflect upon that, you may want to comment upon it now.
Yeah, so we are confident that the bill is compliant with ECHR. The bill allows enforcement officers to gain entry and to search a house or other property. We think that those powers are subject to safeguards. So, for example, that the power to enter a house can only be exercised with permission of the occupier at reasonable times, or where a warrant has been granted. So there is that kind of oversight process through the warrant. Okay.
No,
Can I just pick that?
Yeah, fine for me.
But it says in Power 19.1, Section 19.1, an enforcement officer may, without warrant, enter any place and may search any place. That contradicts to what you've just said. 19.1, an enforcement officer may, without warrant, enter any place and may search any place. And that's what the Police Federation are saying is extraordinary.
I'm sorry, I will come back to you in writing on this, because there are further restrictions on entering houses later on in the bill under section 21. So it says an enforcement officer may take action under section 17 or 19 only if an individual who habitually resides in the house permits the enforcement officer to do so, or if the sheriff grants a warrant for such action.
So you're saying in section 21B, if the sheriff grants a warrant, and then in section 19 you're saying they may enter without a warrant. So which is it? It's contradictory completely.
We can certainly look and see if there's an inconsistency there.
Okay, thank you very much. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. Can I go back to looking at the offences that we have? Now, the bill talks about unauthorised advertising, ticket touting and street trading. And they're all broadly similar to what happened previously when you had the Commonwealth Games in 2014. So are you aware of any offences that were committed in 2014 with reference to advertising, ticket touting and street trading that we can look at in comparison to what we might anticipate going forward in this?
Partners about this, and our understanding is there were no prosecutions under the offences in the previous Act.
So there was no prosecutions?
There were no prosecutions. There were so enforcement officers did engage with people who had breached the restrictions, but there were no prosecutions taken forward as a result of the 2008 Act, is certainly my understanding.
And was it a small number of individuals that were contacted, or was it a reasonably large number? Do we have any statistics about what that entailed?
I can certainly check with partner organisations, but not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so there was nothing that was registered or kept in record. It was only a slap on the wrist that took place.
So I can provide you with more details around about what enforcement action might have been taken in terms of if any property was confiscated or anything like that. I can set out more details of that in writing.
Okay. So we without having some of that information, it's quite difficult then to ascertain what is expected. You know, we could see something similar, or there might be. It might be much larger or much inflated depending on where we are, because the zones that you're looking at covering are quite extensive.
So the Hampden Park zone that we shared is the same size as in 2014.
Right.
The George Square is slightly larger. It includes some additional approach routes. In 2014 there were a range of other zones because there were a number of different games locations at different times across a range of cities. So I think actually overall there's probably less, the zones are less extensive because it focuses on only 3 in the centre of Glasgow rather than having the broader range. Certainly the engagement that we've had so far has indicated we would expect most businesses to want to comply with the restrictions, and as I've mentioned previously, I think a first step would be to make sure that people who are affected are aware of the new offences, and there's a provision in the bill around about Glasgow City Council publishing guidance on the trading and advertising restrictions to try and help with that process. And
consultation with all these different individuals, how extensive has that been? Yes, you're going to provide some kind of structure, you're going to provide rules and regulations that they may have to apply to, but how have you consulted with the trading organisations, Small Business Federation, Chamber of Commerce, or whoever may be affected by this process?
Yes, so we held 2 drop-in sessions for affected businesses. Glasgow City Council invited all street traders with licences in the Hampden Park zone. They also invited all businesses within the zones, the proposed zones, and actually some from out with, who we thought would want to be aware as well. Scottish Government, we contacted Federation of Small Businesses. They were definitely invited and they came along to one of the sessions, so a conversation has taken place with the Federation of Small Businesses. The Glasgow Chamber of Commerce were also invited along.
And how well attended were they?
There were only 2 street traders that attended. For comparison, I think there was only 1 street trader that attended a similar event for 2007. My team have undertaken a number of telephone calls with street traders and other businesses that couldn't attend on the 2 particular days to try and sort of broaden that out a bit as well. And I've also been to Hampden Park before one of the Scotland matches last month to walk around and kind of speak to traders in the general area to try and raise awareness. I think we are conscious, as Derek set out in our statement, that there has been limited time for engagement and we haven't had a formal public consultation, so we are trying to do as much as we can to address that and to speak to people who we think will be affected, but I'm sure there are always other things that we could do to try and help.
Thank you, Convener.
Presumably, if Glasgow City Council licenses street traders, they'll have the names and addresses of all the street traders and can inform them. Is that?
They do, and that's why they contacted the street traders, so they wrote to all the traders that they thought would be affected, yep.
Did you have a supplementary, Stuart?
Yes, thank you. Just when we anticipate the final recommendations or regulations actually be produced and then also issued to all the traders?
So we, as I said previously, we've got illustrative regulations that we hope to share with the committee in the next couple of weeks. We are looking, assuming that the bill completes its parliamentary process early into the new year, looking at how soon we can lay regulations, balancing kind of getting those into force with allowing time to raise awareness of new criminal offences, which we think is important as well. So we're working as swiftly as we can.
So you may be looking towards the end of January to get that information out there?
So I wouldn't want to commit to that date now, but we certainly are looking to do it as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you.
And thank you. Annabel Ewing.
Yes, thank you. Just picking up on an issue to do with advertising and the likely cohort of people that might be impacted, but just very briefly, in our previous conversation on power to enter and search, it's with regard to enter any place and may search any place. The restrictions that Lucy subsequently referred to actually are restrictions relating to any place that is a house or can be entered only through a house. So the restrictions that are applicable are actually not erga omnes, but only to a subset of possibilities. But obviously you're going to write to the committee further on that. Turning to the advertising, I was just a bit puzzled. The information we have is that, so restrictions on advertising in the fan zones would be billboards, which I think everybody can quite understand, or the handing out of free t-shirts or whatever. I think we can get our heads around that. But it also appears that the restrictions would affect businesses which have external advertising, such as restaurants and bars. Could you perhaps provide some clarification as to the extent of that?
Yes, so I think the sort of advertising that we are thinking about, so in the Merchant City in particular, there are bars and restaurants that have external seating and they have kind of temporary sort of windshields around about them, which are obviously, which are often branded with particular products where there might be a competing UEFA sponsor. So it's that sort of thing that we're thinking about where bars and restaurants might be affected. Part of what we're doing in preparing the illustrative advertising and trading regulations is looking at what exceptions we can make to those restrictions so that they're proportionate and that fewer businesses are affected. And again, we've looked at the restrictions that were put in place for the Commonwealth Games, and we'll be looking to incorporate those where we can.
So if there was a restaurant that had an outside seating area, and it will be a time of the year when there might be a possibility that people in Glasgow could be sitting outside, which is not always the case, and they had the windshield, not least to separate the area of the restaurant outside from the edge of pavement and for other purposes as well, and that had on it some product that was of the same in the same generic group as a sponsor of the UEFA Championships, but wasn't the actual product that was sponsored by UEFA. Would that then mean that that restaurant would have to I don't know, what would they do? Because they would presumably they have to have a windshield of some description for licensing purposes.
They have to delineate the
external. You do have to delineate, indeed. Yeah. So what would they have to do, and what thought has been given to, if they have to make an alternative arrangement, what the cost of that would be and the impact on running their business?
So it depends on the particular, I guess, form of the barrier. So some of them you can definitely unhook the branded bit of the advertising and take that off and still have the external kind of bit there. Some of the other ones, it's more kind of sort of etched into it, so then that might require covering in some way. What we are also doing is working with UEFA and sponsors to see whether it would be possible to provide alternative branding, merchandise, you know, something to do with the championships that these businesses would be able to use instead. So that's something that we're looking at as well, to give them a replacement.
Okay. But presumably not necessarily forcing them to have the brand that UEFA is being
No, I
sponsored
think
by.
that's an offer if we could provide something that was consistent with kind of championship branding for the event. But yeah, that would be the decision for business whether they wanted to do that.
Okay, well that's helpful. Thank you for that clarification.
Right. Okay. So would it cover, you know, just, you know, advertising the pizzas on your menu, your restaurant?
No. Anything internal and something like, I think, just a list of pizzas or something that they were going
If
to
you
sell.
had a hoarding outside saying this is what you can eat inside, that wouldn't be covered by these restrictions.
No, I don't think it would be.
Right, okay. There's another couple of groups I just wanted to raise that will be covered. One is charities, and you do say that there may be some exceptions for charities. Will that be in the illustrative regulations? Yes. So you would anticipate that some charities, obviously there will be charities that have their big kind of day of action collecting and that might fall within this. So you'll be giving some exceptions for charities?
Yes.
Yeah, because obviously the Act is enforced until the end of the year, so it would cover, for example, Poppy Day, for example.
So the Act isn't repealed until the 31st of December, but
Yeah.
the Act sets out that the championship period in which the zones can be in operation
Right.
is between
Right, so it's only the championship
thank you.
period, that's fine, but charities would be affected in that period of time. Now, it also says in section 6, subsection 2D, that people providing public entertainment for gain or reward are covered. You may or may not know that Glasgow has a very lively busking scene of young people in Glasgow, and in fact, actually, Emily Sandé, the pop star, is currently making a programme called Street Symphony, where she's showing a programme where she's looking for Scotland's best buskers. So some of these young people, I assume, would be covered by this as well.
So certainly that would be classed as trading. That's something that we're discussing with UEFA at the moment around about what exceptions it might be possible to make for that.
Right. Or maybe have you reached out to some of the young people? You mentioned that you had actually gone out and pounded the pavement yourself. Have you reached out to some of these young people? Because it is quite a lively scene.
So not specifically on that, but certainly we are planning to do further engagement in the zones, so that's something we can look at doing. Happy to do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If there are no further questions from other members, we'll wrap up there. Could you maybe give me an indication? The committee would very much appreciate receiving the illustrative regulations before we consider our Stage 1 report on the 31st of October. So if we could receive the illustrative regulations before that date, it would be extremely helpful to the committee.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll now suspend the meeting for a changeover of witnesses. We now move on to our second panel of witnesses on the UEFA European Championship Scotland Bill, and I would like to welcome to the committee David Henderson, the Public Affairs Manager of the Advertising Association, and Callum Steele, General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation. I'd like to start by referencing your letter to the committee, Callum Steele. Thank you very much. It was a very extensive letter. For the point of view of anyone who may be watching and hasn't had the opportunity to read the letter, I wonder if you could summarise some of the concerns that you've laid out there.
Yeah, yes, thanks, Convener, and good morning. I have to say I would be astonished if people wouldn't read the letters from the Scottish Police Federation. They're usually very, very informative. I mean, in general, the SPF thinks it's very important to maintain the distinction between police officers and others who may be afforded some distinct form of police-like powers, not least because of the unique role police officers hold in society and the standards to which they're held to account. Beyond that, we have, and recognising that to some extent our submission is somewhat blind in that we don't know specifically what's going to be contained in the subsequent regulations, we do have some concerns that there are fairly extensive powers afforded to non-warranted individuals that effectively demand then the support and assistance of police officers. So we could find effectively, if this legislation is passed, that enforcement officers can be carrying out one set of actions to a different set of accountability standards, whilst police officers performing the exact same actions are held to different standards and of course are answerable to the courts. I think it's important to say that we, in general, have no objection to the safeguarding of commercial imagery, but we do wonder whether it's entirely desirable, and recognising it has happened in the past with both the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics, whether it's desirable to seek to impose criminal sanction on what are effectively civil disputes.
Thank you very much for that, and again for your letter. Now, the organising committee for the Games includes Police Scotland, and we did ask the Government Bill team if Police Scotland had raised similar concerns to yourself in the course of discussions in this organising committee, and they said that they had not. How would you respond to that?
It's not unusual for the police service and the Scottish Police Federation to look at the same issue from completely different ends of the spectrum. I suspect that the police service would, after they've had time to review our submission, would probably share fairly similar concerns. But of course, unless the questions were specifically pointed to the issues that are highlighted by the SPF, I see no reason why they would necessarily come to those conclusions on the back of their own bat. My experience of the police service is that they tend to look at legislation, and this is not exclusively, obviously, they tend to look at new legislation through the prism of what it's going to cost the service and what it's going to demand in terms of officer time, and very often they don't go much beyond that. And of course, we have to be sanguine enough in this chamber just now to recognise that this has only been subject to a very short period of consultation, and I'm sure that even the SPF would probably take a more deliberate period of time to look at it prior to subsequent changes and make more detailed submissions. And it may be that just their initial scan of the legislation and the time available meant that the issues passed them by. But these are not wholly different issues that are highlighted by the SPF to those that were highlighted at the time of the Commonwealth Games.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for that. In the policy memorandum for the bill, it says that, like the police can't do this work because they'll be pretty busy policing the football games and ensuring that the public is safe during the tournament. So are you suggesting, like in page 2 of your letter, you say the SPF has a long-standing opposition to extending of pseudo-police powers to non-police officers, as this risks delegitimising the clear and distinct role society expects in its police officers to perform, which is fair enough and very clear. Are you saying that actually it should be police officers that are doing the enforcement role here?
I think, if I'm going to be so bold, convener, to maybe go back one step before then, and it's ultimately comes down to the fundamental question as to whether you consider it's appropriate that we introduce specific legislation to criminalise what are effectively civil disputes. Right. If Parliament takes the view that that is something that it desires, then the question of who should be enforcing the criminal law is one which is very real. And in general, police officers are those that enforce the criminal law.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. Claire Baker.
Thank you, convener. First of all, for Callum Steele, Mr Steele, you said that the legislation is obviously similar to the 2014 Commonwealth Games legislation, and I understand the role of the enforcement officer is similar, unless you've identified differences in this legislation. Were there any issues that arose from the 2014 in terms of how the relationship between the police and the enforcement officers worked?
Yes, and again, through yourself, convener, there were. I mean, they weren't insurmountable, but there were issues. I think it's again heavily caveated by the fact that I haven't had an awful lot of time to undertake research with officers that were heavily involved in the activities around about 2014, and indeed the Olympics, where broadly comparable restrictions were in place. But we did identify, even in the short time available to me, that there were some instances of conflict, and particularly in terms of the expectation from the enforcement officers as to what they were expecting the police officers to do. So, for example, it was highlighted to me that there was some kind of guerrilla or ambush advertising from a gambling company, and there were expectations and asks of the police service. I mean, I'd have to check the absolute veracity of this as to whether it went to this extent, that we were to pull together some kind of specialist assets to go and remove banners from high-up buildings. That is one element of it, and the expectation that causes the police to reprioritise their own expectations and their own demands to service the ask from enforcement officers. But even on a more practical level, on the more mundane, even the feeding of police officers that were working at the events raised points of conflict, where the police service was providing food and refreshments from, let's call it a well-known high street bakery, which were not part of the advertising sponsorship elements of the Commonwealth Games, and that led to significant conflict at the point of trying to get police officers fed and refreshed. Now, I think we can all safely assume that a fairly hefty diplomatic incident was avoided through, well, without being too unkind, probably through brute force and powers of persuasion. But it does tend to show that there can be points of conflict at levels that are not necessarily thought would exist for the enforcement of the legislation.
Okay, yeah, the Bill team earlier did say that they are only now speaking to partners who were involved in the 2014 Commonwealth Games. It might have been they didn't anticipate we'd be looking at legislation again, but there seems to have been little kind of investigation into how that all operated and how the legislation worked the last time. Can I ask Mr Henderson about the experience from the 2014 Commonwealth Games in terms of advertising, and were there any lessons that could be learned from what happened in 2014?
Yes, so thank you, Claire. Just to say at the outset that I wasn't involved in that at the time, so I'm looking back at this retrospectively. We as an association didn't have any objections. We had good engagement with the Scottish Government throughout the process leading up to the 2014 Commonwealth Games, and we were happy with the protections that were put in place. As to whether the same framework should be lifted now for what is a slightly different type of championship competition, we're still engaging with stakeholders as to their views on that. As to whether you take an Olympic Commonwealth Games model, which is based in a specific country over a longer period of time, and apply that same framework to somewhere where there's maybe only 4 matches happening as part of a Europe-wide championship, but that's something that we're looking at. But in answer to your question, no real specific issues.
Would there be, because you're suggesting there's a difference between Commonwealth and Olympics, and the the championship, the UEFA. Have they announced who the sponsors are yet? Just are you aware of because the how it's been explained to us by the Bill team is that within the zones there would be restrictions. It would really only be the sponsors that could be highlighted and being promoted, and that would place challenges on certain businesses. Do we know yet who the sponsors are? And how
as far as I know, the sponsors have been appointed. I can't say with certainty at this stage who they are, but they are obviously massive multinational corporations. I think you've got an issue there where you're trying to strike a balance between supporting the investment of those sponsors in sponsoring the games, while also some smaller businesses in perhaps one of the specific locations who should, in theory, be able to take advantage of the goodwill and the celebratory nature of the competition. And particularly in Glasgow, I'm sure there's lots of businesses there that would want to not necessarily take advantage, but get into the spirit of the games and the commercial benefit that would come from being a smaller enterprise there. So it's striking that correct balance between protecting the sponsors while also letting everyone else kind of get into the feel of things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. A couple of questions for Cam Steele and the Police Federation around enforcement and some of the very useful points that you raised in your letter. So by my understanding of the bill, there is a set of searches that enforcement officers would have the power to carry out, but only in the presence of a police officer. So enforcement officers would have the power to carry out a search of someone's home or to carry out a search that required force to gain entry, but only in the presence of a police officer. That was the substantial point that we engaged with the Bill team on in the previous session this morning. There's a second set of searches, though, searches of vehicles, containers, for example, that I don't believe require a police presence. I was wondering if you could comment on the distinction between what are essentially two separate sets of criteria for the conducting of searches by these enforcement officers.
Thanks, Convener. If I may, I think there's also a third criteria, and that's where the search relates to a premises that's not a home, because the restriction on the presence or the requirement for a police officer, as far as my reading of it is concerned, relates only to the search of a home. This is going to return time and again to the point that I made it very early on in my oral submissions, and that is about the significant power to effect a search of people's belongings, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a vessel, whether it's a commercial premises, or whether it's some form of other premises that are owned by an individual that do not amount to a home. I mean, ultimately, I think the ludicrousness of it, if I may be so bold, is that the enforcement officer is the one who seems to have the power to secure the warrant, but is only able to act upon it in the presence of a police officer. And as my reading, unless there's going to be a wholesale change, it would be the actions of the police officer that would then be subject to complaint and scrutiny, even though they may not be privy wholly to the basis upon which the warrant was secured. So it's not impossible to foresee that a search being undertaken on a premise, on a domestic premises, for example, where the sheriff was satisfied with the testimony of the enforcement officer that was required, that the actions of the police officer are those which then become subject to further complaint and potentially civil action against the chief constable. It's just not something that I am particularly, or the Scottish Police Federation, are particularly comfortable with. The use of police powers and police actions are very heavily instilled in the individual. We instinctively recoil against the notion that we go along to hold someone's hand to be their witness, unless they have, reporting authorities. For example, as we see with the SSPCA, where attendance in those circumstances is comparable, but SSPCA officers have different powers available to them.
And just to clarify, is the Police Federation's position that in circumstances that would currently require the presence of a police officer to execute a search, that the power to execute those kind of searches should simply be held by police officers and not by enforcement officers? That there's no need for enforcement officers to have that particular search power?
Well, as the legislation is drafted, when it comes to domestic premises, there certainly is, unless someone's able to persuade me otherwise, there's certainly no need for enforcement officers to have those powers. I mean, beyond the issue of domestic premises, I think there are inherent risks for enforcement officers in their own right to be able to undertake searches of commercial or other premises. We can be talking outbuildings, sheds, garages, empty shop fronts, whatever it may be, not least because of the potential hostility that will or could face from the owner of the other premise, whatever it might be.
Thank you. And just one brief operational question to finish. From my understanding of it, it appears that the use of a locksmith to gain entry to a premises doesn't qualify as the use of force to gain entry. So it comes under that category where an enforcement officer would not require the presence of a police officer if they were using a locksmith to gain entry, whereas if they had to use brute force to gain entry, that would obviously require the presence of police officers. How does that match with the current mode of operation for the police? What's your position on this definition of the use of a locksmith would not be comparable to the use of brute force and thus wouldn't require a police presence?
Well, I think, if I may be so bold, I think this exposes one of the other areas of concern in the legislation, in that it provides the enforcement officer the ability, the unfettered ability, apparently, to call upon assistance from any other person. And who determines whether the locksmith in this particular case is a bona fide locksmith or whether it's just someone who happens to have a drill and is very good at getting into doors? So I think that there are some fairly significant weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the legislation as drafted. To me, if you've got to overcome the security of something to effect entry, that's forcing entry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I have a few questions for Callum and then a few for David, if I may. So on the same issue as Ross Greer had raised, first of all, it's not clear to me, did the SPF make a submission with regard to the legislation for the 2014 Commonwealth Games? Because, not least, I ask the question because my understanding is that this legislation, as far as enforcement is concerned, effectively the new bit is the power to enter and search. The other offences were there effectively substantially the same as the 2014 arrangements. So I'm just trying to understand how we've arrived at this point. So did the SPF make a submission and then the 2014 Commonwealth Games arrangement?
The short answer to your question is yes. It was the submission was made in the name of my predecessor, and of my memory, which is not that bad, serves me right, it was made in 2007. So there was a much longer lead-in period for the legislation for the Commonwealth Games versus the lead-in time for this proposed piece of legislation. And whilst my search of the SPF archive and the time available was only able to identify one submission that was made, it clearly makes reference to earlier submissions, and whilst the subsequent submission contains many of the substantive points that are contained in the SPF's written response in my name today, it's very clear that there were additional concerns raised at an earlier first draft of the bill.
Okay, so we could presumably find that back through the parliamentary archives, I would have thought might be a possible route. But so basically it seems you're saying that the SPF had similar concerns in vis-à-vis the 2014 arrangements as you have presented in the letter we received yesterday. Okay, if two issues then, one that's part of being addressed. So solutions to this, because we all want these championships to happen in Glasgow. Everybody wants that. So solution, what are the solutions? So is it then that we seek to suggest that the enforcement, the power to enter and search provisions are redrafted in a way that meets concerns raised? And or is it the case that you would be advocating that we don't have the trading standards officers involved in any aspect of this, accepting that we do proceed to make these criminal offences as the deterrent? So do we not go down the trading standards route? What would be your position?
Oh, well, that's a very broad question, if I may be so bold, Convener.
Well, we've got to find a solution, so, you know, kind of practical.
Well, as I made out at the start of the SPS submission, it seems a peculiar approach recognising the strength of large brands such as UEFA, FIFA, Olympics, Commonwealth Games, it does seem a peculiar approach that we consider that our legislation to protect day-to-day image rights are not sufficiently robust to protect when the big boys come to town. That, to me, is something that, if we have weaknesses, that should be addressed as a substantive approach rather than periodically coming up with sticking plasters, if that's an appropriate descriptor, when the large-scale events come around. This is me personally, mindful of the fact that we are in very short time. But I don't think that there is anybody out there, a police officer or other member of the public, that objects to the principles of safeguarding the investment that certain brands and entities make in supporting large-scale sporting events. I believe that my members and members of society abhor the issue of ticket touting, and in general we are wholly supportive of any civil enforcement that makes it more unlikely than likely that this kind of activity will be pursued. In terms of what might be an appropriate response, I would like to take more time to consider that, but freewheeling somewhat. I think it should not be beyond the wit of all of us to come up with a very simple piece of legislation that states that overt advertising of the specific brands that will be contained in a schedule relative to those that are sponsoring the championships will only be permitted to be displayed within certain areas. Thereafter, of course, we get, and to some extent the legislation kind of hints at that, thereafter we get to the issue of enforcement. And for me, that when it comes to anything that involves something that looks like police powers, that very much has to remain with police officers. And at this point in time, no one has made reference to Section 17 powers in terms of the use of force. And I think that there is a potential vulnerability there. Let's hypothesise that we have someone carrying a branded cup of a type that is not bearing the logo of the sponsor that is paying a lot of money to be there. And the individual objects to the surrendering of that item to an enforcement officer. At the point of trying to remove it, force is being used. And that's entirely contradictory to the further provisions that are contained in the bill that says force shall not be used against a person. So we seem to be creating the potential for lots of Mexican standoffs, effectively. Give me the cup. No. And then we call the police, and the police are involved in trying to seize a cup. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the kind of consequence that we're looking to create with legislation here.
Okay, I mean, it is, as you say, quite rightly, the devil is in the detail, and it would be helpful, I think, to have your further reflections on behalf of the SPF, because we have a very limited time within which to scrutinise this legislation. A few questions, if I may, very briefly, to David Henderson. So, we had a discussion on the advertising restrictions with the Bill team. I don't know if you heard that. So 2 quick questions. Obviously, it would affect billboard space. So in advance of that, presumably then there would have to be a different set of arrangements in terms of who can pay to advertise on these large hoardings. What's to happen practically with regard to that? And do you see... do you have concerns that there might be undue restrictions on the freedom to advertise one's business?
I suppose on the first point, what we really need at this stage, and obviously we fully appreciate the time constraints in terms of getting this legislation through, and I suppose it picks up on Callum's point before around the run-up to the Commonwealth Games bill. Obviously we put in a submission in 2007, 2008, and we had almost years of engagement to kind of get thrashed through that finer detail. The face of the bill, we at the outset have no objections, particularly the offences around ticket touting. We think that is, well, obviously that's fundamental to the licensing conditions with UEFA, and that has to be sorted. On the actual advertising specific elements, and again it picks up on points that Callum made, whether we need specific additional criminal offences for things which are already protected through civil law, through passing off copyright, trademark, the Committee of Advertising Practice, codes enforced by the Advertising Standards Authority. Whether that additional layer of protection is necessary at the moment, we're not 100% sure and can't say with certainty whether we think that the bill needs to go that far. I think what's really, really key for us now is getting the additional guidance and the secondary legislation, getting sight of that as soon as possible and having ongoing consultation with industry, because as you say, particularly in out-of-home space, advertising is ran months and months and months in advance, so we need certainty really now as to what we're going to be doing next summer when the games are occurring.
Okay, I mean, 2 points. One, on the issue of the criminal offence, I mean, that vis-à-vis the advertising restrictions, that was indeed the case for the 2014 Commonwealth Games arrangement, so that is the same. That's not a new thing. And again, it would be interesting to see what the submission was at the time of that legislation from the Advertising Standards body. But with regard to the secondary legislation, I think we agree that that is absolutely key. I mean, do you have any notion at this stage in terms of your membership what they want to see as regards the exemptions to the offence?
I suppose the main first and foremost exemption that we would be pressing vigorously for would be an exception for newspapers and news publications, magazines. And that, I suppose, comes down to the scope of the definition of ambush marketing and whether you take a narrow approach to that or whether you take a broad approach to that. In our view, ambush marketing should be something that is deliberately targeted at someone in the vicinity of an event's location, and whether there's advertising in a newspaper which someone happens to be reading in an event's location that they've purchased elsewhere and brought in with them, we'd like to see the scope of that narrowed down so that there's a broad exception for all news media in that sense. In terms of wider exceptions, there's obviously concerns around out-of-home advertising where transport is concerned, maybe advertisements on buses, taxis, and how far those are likely to come into the space of the event zones. I have to apologise, I haven't had a chance yet to look at the actual location map, so I can't say with certainty what the chances of that are happening, but that would be an additional concern. I'm sure there will be more concerns which are raised as we consult with members, but obviously given the very tight time constraints, we haven't had a chance to get full feedback yet. But we would be looking to see initial thoughts on what the exceptions would be, and then we would hope to engage further in consultation with the government as to defining those exceptions and ensuring that they're fit for purpose for industry's perspective.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Just when you mentioned newspapers, in the centre of Glasgow, there'll be a number of freestanding newspaper vendors for the local newspapers, the Herald and Times, which I used to work for, so there's a declaration. Would they be able to trade as normal?
Well, this is what we would like to hope, that they would be able to trade as normal. It's a slightly different issue, I suppose, in the sense of someone coming ambush marketing having a front and centre advert appearing as opposed to an advert for a non-affiliated brand inside a newspaper with obviously other content ongoing. Do you see what I mean? It very much broadens the scope of what would actually be prohibited under the provisions of the bill if you do not have that exemption in place for news media. There's also additional concerns potentially around advertorials. Obviously, it's very much the case that content in the newspaper will be maybe referring to something that's happening in the games, and whether advertising that appears alongside that, while not necessarily associated with that editorial piece, is then brought into the scope. So that's what we're really looking for clarity on in the exemptions.
I think the committee will be looking for clarity on that as well. Thank you very much. Mike Rumbles.
Thanks, Convener. My question is particularly to Callum Steele. I mean, I said to the other witnesses earlier on this morning that when I saw the bill, I thought the real problems on enforcement, and your letter reflects that. So I would like to look at section 17.4. And you say in your evidence to us on 17.4, we have grave reservations about both principle and practice on this issue. If it is envisaged that 17.4 could see persons other than police officers being relied upon to assist, this creates a potential for a free-for-all with random citizens subjected to potential zero validation, able to exercise powers of entry and search, seizure and destruction. The inherent risks in this approach ought to be self-evident. So you say if it's envisaged by the bill team, by the minister, by the government. It seems to me on reading section 17.4 that that's exactly what their intention is, because if they'd wanted police officers to do that, they would have said assisted by police officers. So the intention in the bill, as far as I can see it, is not to have police officers assisting them, but to basically give legal protection to anybody that, I mean, examples have been made of a locksmith, but actually this could mean an enforcement officer saying, hey, Mr. Smith, I want you to help me to do this, and this bill gives legal protection to what Mr. Smith is doing. Is that my interpretation correct, do you think?
I fear it may be. And ultimately, this is one of the underpinning concerns that the SPF has. It's about the issue of accountability, complaint. Where's the public validation of the approval of the individuals that are going to be performing fairly intrusive tasks? Because the issue of enforcement, whether it extends to search, seizure, destruction, or whatever, are intrusive acts, and they are, as powers, they are vested upon very limited individuals at this particular point in time, and those individuals in their own right are subject to fairly rigorous scrutiny and validation effectively by bodies on behalf of the general public. There's no indication from the bill as drafted that, first of all, that ministers are even going to set any standards for those that are going to be qualified as enforcement officers. Whether there's no indication of any minimum periods of training, no indication as to the type of persons that may be disbarred from undertaking those activities, and there's yet a further dilution at 17.4 with the any other person element of it. Now, as I also expanded that any other person at 17.4 has a particular potential pernicious power available to them when you get to 19.2 in terms that you can have any random person turning up with any random piece of equipment into premises to assist the enforcement officer based on the enforcement officer's view that this is necessary, no further test if it's not a domestic dwelling. And I mean, the obvious thing that we look at now are electronic communications. That equipment taken in by a random person who may well have skills and experiences in undertaking forensic examinations of computers, hard drives, devices. I mean, I just think it's a quagmire.
Mm-hmm. Could you also, I mean, I raised with previous witnesses from the bill team what I thought was a little bit of confusion. In section 19, section 19.1, power to enter and search, it says an enforcement officer may, without warrant, enter any place and may search any place and any vehicle, vessel, container, other thing at that place without a warrant, where the officer reasonably believes or has been used in connection with a championship offence, in past tense. And then there is, on paragraph 21, a further restriction on entering houses. So there's an exception with houses. But that apart from that exception with houses, where the police officer, I think it's a warrant must be, a sheriff grants a warrant for that action. But that gives much greater powers to an enforcement officer than it does to a police officer, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Gosh, right. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Stuart, did you have a supplementary you wanted to?
Yes, thank you. Just it was when Callum was talking about the coffee cup example. So that actually already seems to be covered in terms of an exemption in the bill, section 11.3d, in terms of the display of an advertisement on an individual's body, clothing, or personal property. So obviously the coffee cup could either be a single-use cup or a plastic multi-use cup.
I mean, it says it may. The issue is that the decision comes down to that of the enforcement officer. Throughout the legislation, I can't remember specifically whether it says in the opinion, or I think it's slightly more qualified than the opinion of, but it's the sole judgment of the enforcement officer. So, the enforcement officer may well take a view that a cup this size is fine, but a cup this size is not fine. And that then raises the issue of the removal of the supposed offending item, and also in the requirement that force is to be used, given it says it's not to be used upon a person. It's impossible to see how a removal of an item without the individual's consent is anything other than the use of force. How that then results in the police officer's judgment, because police powers are vested in the police officer themselves and cannot be instructed to be used by any other individual, how the police officer's judgment and considered course of action may well conflict with that of the enforcement officer, because it does seem that the enforcement officer's view is the one that is greater in significance than that of the police officer in this particular element.
We'll do have a separate issue.
Right, okay. Very briefly.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
on you go.
It's something that's a lot more common now as compared to when we had the Commonwealth Games, is the issue of pop-up shops. I've noticed that's not covered in the bill, and particularly in the zones that have been identified, also run up to Hampden and also within the city centre. Would you have any recommendations as to how to deal with these? Because sometimes the pop-up shops, someone might just rent a space for a week, and also the period of time this is going to take place. You could potentially have maybe 5 different traders operating in that period of time in one single location.
I think, with the convener's good grace, this is a question that I would have to defer to those with better expertise on it than me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Mr Till, we already touched on the enforcement issues and some of the concerns you have around that whole area. But one area we haven't touched on is potentially the cost of that. Now, in the financial memorandum which accompanies the bill, there are estimates that what Glasgow Council may have to deal with when it comes to the enforcement. And they talk about it could vary between 50,000 and 94,000, depending on the countries that are taking part. Once that's established, and if it is at the higher end for what we'd expect Glasgow Council to manage, there has to be an implication onto the Police Scotland as to how that would impact. Have you got any views on that?
I mean, in general, there's rarely a piece of legislation that is passed by this Parliament that doesn't have a cost in some way, shape or form for the police service. In terms of the specific legislation here, it does look as though most of the costs will fall upon the City Council. If we do get to the stage where police officers are routinely called upon or are expected to be called upon to enforce the powers of search and entry, and indeed the use of force upon an individual, that is a consequential cost that would need to be understood. Certainly, my experience of anything that accompanies pieces of legislation is that costs tend to be grossly underestimated rather than being anywhere close to being reflective of reality. To some extent, I think it's going to be difficult to get a fair assessment of the costs until such time as we see what the regulations are going to look like. If Parliament determines that it doesn't want to specify any specific qualifying criteria or training standards or minimum or debarred elements for enforcement officers, then that will have a beneficial impact on cost of the police service, and that there will be likely to be very little. If, of course, it takes a contrary view, then the expectation, I would imagine, would extend that the police officers provide that level of training and awareness as to how to make sure that they stay on the right side of the law. And, of course, depending on how far Parliament wishes to go, if Parliament wishes to extend, for example, and this is not explicitly stated in the SPF submission, but if Parliament is of the view that it wants to extend the oversight on the activities of enforcement officers to potentially the likes of the Police Investigation and Review Commissioner, there will be further costs contained in that should a member of the public wish to complain about the manner in which they were treated.
And I think you identify very, very rightly what could happen and what might happen under a situation and circumstance. And it's important that we are aware of that because, as I say, there would potentially be implications that could be not seen, but would then have to be utilised and implemented by Police Scotland to manage that. So have Police Scotland got any scenarios as to how they think that worked, if they've looked at what's maybe happened in the past when events of this nature have come along?
I'm afraid that's a question you'd have to ask of Police Scotland.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
Yes, thank you. It's really a very general question. I mean, I, for my part, share the concerns that you've expressed both in this letter and today about the sort of quagmire that we could potentially be entering by creating this kind of hybrid of an enforcement officer, which is more than a local authority officer, but not quite a police officer. There is, however, they have been used before, and I just wonder if what safeguards you could propose, given there are issues of resource and practicality in terms of using the police, but what safeguards you could propose that might assist us sort of resolving this problem? Are there any, you mentioned greater oversight of them. Is there anything else that you think could bolster?
I'm wondering if we may be swapping pay packets. That sounds as though I'm being asked to find the legislative fix. I'm not sure that this is particularly easy, and indeed it may be that concerns that exist around principles are not played out in practice. But we can't. I think we would be foolish to rush in and legislate ignorant of the potential for risks and hazards in this regard. My sense is that through lots of early advertising as to what kind of restrictions are going to be in place, that most of the areas of conflict, particularly on personal conflict, will be minimised. But we have to recognise that whilst any targeting of advertising that we undertake in Scotland will, or certainly particularly in Glasgow, will be likely to be seen by Scottish citizens, it's not necessarily guaranteed that those that would be coming to support their national team from other nations would be as aware as Scots would be of those limitations. And of course, I think we have to be mindful also that whilst we have recent experience of the Commonwealth Games and to a lesser extent the Olympics in terms of public footprint and the expectations of local authorities as to how events are to be policed, if I may use the word loosely, it's unclear to me that citizens of other countries would necessarily take the view that some random person calling themselves an enforcement officer is perceived to have powers to ask them to conform to any particular direction that they may be expecting. So I think a lot of it can be done with very early advertising, particularly to deal with the Scottish element of it. Once the draw is made and once we know what the makeup of the teams coming to Scotland would be, I would think it would be appropriate for the City Council to engage with the governments of the visiting nations to make sure that they are similarly aware. It may well be some kind of literature that accompanies the tickets or the air flights that are sold. I just can't get away from the fact that anything that introduces the use of force to a non-police officer is inherently problematic and creates the potential for conflict. And whilst in its own right that is intended to take the time and the effort away from the police officer side, it's difficult to see that that would indeed be the case. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Could I ask Mr Henderson, for the advertising industry, when do you need all the regulations to be in place, given that the tournament starts in June, to allow your industry to prepare?
I mean, in an ideal world, we would like the exemptions on the face of the bill, purely just so that we have a heads up now as to what to expect, so we can put preparations in place.
Right.
From both a sort of macro point of view, it's not that difficult, but it's once you drill down into the smaller businesses that need to be aware of the restrictions in place, that there might be slightly more of a communication issue. We, obviously, as a network of trade associations, have great links with the breadth of the industry, but trying to get that message out in adequate time for people to have appropriate advertising in place will take time.
Okay.
Failing the exemptions being in the face of the bill just as soon as possible in the new year, really.
Have you put in writing the exemptions you would like to see in place?
Not yet, but we can provide that as supplementary evidence to the committee.
Yes, if you could do that to the committee, that would, and as soon as possible, given the
course.
timescales, that would be really, really helpful. I just thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the issue of touting, because it's kind of quite clear from our earlier exchanges with Scottish Government officials and in terms of the policy memorandum for the bill, that the law on touting in Scotland is clearly not really adequate, and that is backed up by the Association of Tartan Army Clubs, who've submitted some written evidence saying that although touting is not common at matches involving the Scottish national team, it is a big problem. And I think the fact that, Scotland is one of, I think, 4 or 5 countries out of the 12 that have been asked to bring forward this temporary legislation clearly shows that it's a problem that we may need to tackle in terms of wider legislation in future. Now, Callum Steele, you had said that you have a problem with this bill in terms of enforcing some of the touting legislation because it's not just Scotland, it's overseas as well, it's online touting. I wonder if you could expand more on that and say, you know, if we did bring forward legislation at some point in the future to deal with what is clearly understood to be a problem, if the police service would be able to deal with that.
Thank you, Convener. And if I may just expand that slightly, it's not concern over the practice, it's concern over the enforceability. Yeah. Whether someone is touting immediately outside the stadium or touting from a bedroom in the Ukraine, the net effect is that somebody somewhere is paying over the odds for a ticket and someone else is being deprived of the opportunity to get one at face value. I mean, the nature of crime that takes place online means that it's largely resource intensive and return minimal. So, you know, putting it on the face of the bill is laudable. But I'm just adding a health warning that we shouldn't necessarily expect miracles to be performed by either enforcement officers or the Police Service of Scotland to bring ticket touts that operate online to heel.
Right. I mean, does the Police Service of Scotland, do we have capacity to deal with that kind of online crime at the moment?
That's my favourite type of question, Convener. I'm sure no sooner have you asked it than you realise that my answer is going to be no, we don't. And indeed, it's true of the police service that in many areas that we could always do more if we had more. I think it's highly unlikely that ticket touting, regardless of the pernicious effect it has upon events and individuals who are losing out, would be considered a high priority crime for the police service to investigate.
Okay, thank you very much. And just finally, for me, under the section of the bill that deals with trading, I know that in your letter you raised concerns about the effect that might have on charities, and I raised with the bill team this morning about the young people in Glasgow who are buskers, and it's quite a lively scene, and I mentioned that Emily Sandy is currently has a programme on television about the talent of these young people. And obviously from an enforcement point of view, we certainly don't want to be criminalising charities, and we don't want to be criminalising a young person with a guitar. How do you see that like panning out on the ground to avoid criminalising these people?
Well, there is that element also, and I'll return to that shortly, but I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that the nature of charitable giving has changed significantly over the past number of years. And, you know, it's not unusual, for example, for benefactors to bequeath tickets for events, you know, for example, to cup finals, as part of a charitable fundraising for a completely unrelated entity. Now, in its own right, that would appear to be touting, and that it's seeking to make a profit for a charity, albeit it's not one for material gain for an individual. So I think that kind of thing has to be looked at and understood as well. You know, it would be peculiar if a generous individual was to offer 2 tickets to a UEFA Championship match in Glasgow to support, say, a local hospice, and that was then to be bought by an individual in support of that local hospice, only for the potential question of whether that was a profit, whether that would amount to some form of ticketing offence. But in addition to that, and I think this is something that is generally welcome, if we look at the type of charitable giving that takes place, particularly around football, at this point in time, we see that there are lots of drives to gather supplies for food banks. It's very much club-led, and I appreciate that there's a world of difference between individual football clubs and national sporting teams, but the general approach from football fans is one that is increasingly becoming more generous in terms of support of charitable activities. And my concern, and I think the SPF's concern, is that it would look bad on both UEFA, in fact on UEFA, on Scotland as a nation, and indeed on the police service and enforcement officers, if we were seen to be taking away brackets and destroying potentially items that had been bequeathed for the purpose of charitable entities. And again, I think it's probably one of those unintended elements that could be a feature of the legislation was not subject to the very helpful scrutiny that you're providing it just now.
Okay, thanks very much. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Just on this point, just regarding the buskers, when we had the Commonwealth Games, are you aware of any youths, particularly maybe kind of some kids from the age of 8 to about 14, 15 or so, who actually just went and basically kind of turned up somewhere and started to play their instrument just to make some kind of pocket money, and how they were actually dealt with? Because I'm thinking in terms of the opportunity for next year, and it's such a big event, you're going to have young people in particular who just want to kind of take part in it and have that opportunity. I certainly wouldn't want them to be criminalised or treated with a heavy hand, and I wouldn't imagine that would be the case. I mean, I'm not suspecting it would be, but I would want that sensitivity to actually be implemented and actually dealing with them, as compared to any other type of kind of negative possibility that could happen to them.
Thanks, Convener. In terms of the question from the Commonwealth Games, you know, if we are going to move to more detailed evidence before stage 2, which I would helpfully suggest is probably going to be required, then I'll be able to address that question. It's not one that I asked specifically about before I came here today. And of course, we can't ignore the enterprising abilities of young people to provide vehicle security around football matches as well. It seems to be a fairly common activity in and around Glasgow. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think it would be unfortunate if we were to seek to, create barriers between, instruments of the state and those that are trying to, take advantage of. Effectively, let's be honest with it, it's not going to. It's someone raising a couple of £100 by playing bad bagpipes. Is not going to. Is not going to.
Funny enough,
it's not going to break UEFA.
No, because that's the thing. Also, when you go to Hampden, you go to international matches. I mean, the streets up to Hampden. I mean, there are plenty of young kids out doing a bit of piping, and it's just to take part in it, and that will be the case certainly for next year.
Well, and indeed, and it would seem peculiar for a country as proud of its cultural heritage as Scotland is to seek to put any limitations on that. That's a personal view rather than the organisation's view.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from members? Mike?
I'll go back to a question I asked the other panel. In section 2, subsection 4, it says we're going to ban ticket touting. The offence of ticket touting, we're criminalising it. The touting offence doesn't apply in relation to acts done by UEFA. In other words, this bill would ban ticket touting, but not ticket touting by UEFA. In other words, selling a ticket above its face value of the ticket. Does that cause any concern?
I think I may request to take the fifth on that. That would be the expression.
But that's a question for UEFA when you come before us. Can I thank both of our witnesses for coming to give evidence to us today, and we shall now move into private session. Thank you very much.